Marvin Devine. I'm saying bye to all the lies and all the times you cried, saying that I wasn't right, yet I was right by your side. You manipulator, playing games, your friends commentators, and I don't know what you say about our private conversations, but it's got them hating. Thanks to all the rumors you be claiming. It's cool, I'm done with you, so they can throw you a celebration. You gon' hate it when you see me with somebody living better. I'm trying to tell you that me just doing me gon' have you jealous.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to the program. It's Chris live in central Pennsylvania at this unearthly hour. It's like being in the Army again. It's 6:30 in the morning. Of course, it's not 6:30 in the morning on the other side of the Atlantic. My special guest today is none other than my friend Mark. Well, can I call him my friend? I might be in trouble if I do that. I should have asked first. Mark Oppenheimer. So yesterday, we heard from the head of a political party, Dr. Mulder from the Freedom Front Plus. And we also heard from a spokesman for a civil rights organization, AfriForum. And today we'll hear from a member of the legal profession, Mark. We're going to talk about what's next for Julius here, folks. Mark can't answer every question, so if you want to know what the aerodynamic wind velocity of an unladen swallow is, we can't answer that question. No, but seriously, there's a few legal things he can't answer. It's like the previous case with Julius Malema. Last time I had Mark on, it's been quite a while, and there were some things not allowed to talk about. But nonetheless, we want to hear what Mark's got to say and talk about the process of what comes next, because he's going to appeal. He can't appeal the conviction, but he can't appeal the sentencing. What I watched before Mark jumps in here is that this magistrate was very, very precise and circumspect. She took her time. I can't imagine there's anything here for him legitimately to appeal. But with that, Mark, welcome back to the program. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Absolute pleasure. So, when I'm in court with my colleagues, we have to refer to each other as our learned friends. So I can call you my friend. I'm not sure if you're a learned friend, but it's always been lovely seeing you in person when you come visit South Africa.
Recording in progress.
Sorry about that. It wasn't recording. I had to push that. Well, thank you. What do you mean you don't know if I'm learned? I've got like 18 educational degrees. I better be learned. Otherwise, I wasted tens of thousands of dollars.
Well, I think that lots of people that spend a lot of money at especially prestigious Ivy League universities really have wasted tens of thousands of dollars. So you wouldn't be alone on that front.
Oh my goodness! And who brought this guy on? Who's booking where's my agent at? No, but seriously. So Mark, I did a poll, like I'm sure lots of people did, but I didn't play the poly market. Maybe I should have done that. But on the sentencing, but even the night before, the plurality of people, almost the majority, about 48% of my viewers said he's not going to get any jail time. It's going to be a slap on the wrist. But I was initially kind of skeptical that they wouldn't do anything. And then I saw how hard the state was pushing for a 15-year sentence. That caught me a little bit by surprise. Of course, one of the things people talk about all the time is the MK and the EFF and the ANC are all going to get together. I'm like, that's not going to happen. I mean, it's a possibility, but it's unlikely. Mostly because as long as Ramaphosa is there, he hates Julius Malema, and he's not going to allow that to happen. So I don't know why the state pushed. I don't disagree. He had 5, essentially what we call here would be felony convictions. And here he is. By the way, the irony, I'll ask you about this, Mark. I mean, the man is a convicted criminal, and he selects justices through the Judicial Services Commission. Is there not a bit of irony in that?
Yes, there is. And what's interesting is that John Klopper, who'd been a judge who was impeached, one of the few South African judges to ever be impeached, his name had been put forward to serve on the Judicial Service Commission, and there was a challenge brought to say that he's improper. You have to be good and be fit and proper. And Klopper withdrew his name. One of the provisions in our Constitution is that if you have been sentenced to jail time of 12 months or more, that you are then no longer fit and proper to serve in Parliament. But given that there is an appeal process at the moment, then that doesn't have that effect. But if it is confirmed, then Mr. Malema wouldn't be able to serve in Parliament, and he wouldn't be able to serve on the JSC. One thing worth clarifying, so the process in court yesterday, at the end of the sentence being handed down, they moved immediately into leave to appeal proceedings. And so leave to appeal is different from an appeal. Leave to appeal, you basically ask the presiding judge for the right to bring an appeal. And what the judge said was, I will grant you that with regards to sentence, but not with regards to the merits. But that doesn't close the discussion on the merits. What it then requires Mr. Malema to do is to then petition the higher court to say, we think we've got reasonable prospects of success of the merits being heard, a different conclusion being reached on an appeal, and so they must run that process as well. So it is possible that a high court would grant that petition and could reverse the merits decision as well, in which case he would no longer be a convict.
Yes, exactly. He can. But again, looking at the case and what's gone on, I don't see any legitimate basis for him to go forward with that, or for the High Court to even take on this case. Of course, and in this one, you can correct me on unrelated to this. You know, the so-called hate speech trial and the Kill the Boer song, the so-called liberation song from a group that didn't exist during the liberation struggle and whose most of its members weren't even alive at the time, yet they sing this vile song. The Kill the Boer song, 20 years ago, I thought the High Court in South Africa, one of the High Courts, said that this was hate speech. And then more recently, they refused to hear it when a lower court said that it was freedom of speech. It gets a little confusing, and I think a lot of people forget that this was previously declared hate speech, or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, so in 2011, AfriForum had brought a case against the ANC, and Julius Malema was a member of the Youth League, and so he was cited in that. And there, Judge Lamont found that the song Dibulu Ubunu amounted to hate speech. The matter was then revisited when I ran it in 2021, 22. And there the trial court found that it did not amount to hate speech. They don't actually really rely much on free speech as a defense. What the court there said was that if you understand the song correctly, it is really a song targeted at the ANC and their failures in land reform. That's what's in the original judgment. Now, what's interesting about that finding is that the Social Research Foundation did a poll asking people, what do you think the song means? And that was listed as an option, and it's the one that came out dead last. The one that came out as the highest was that it is a literal song, which is that it is calling for Afrikaners to be murdered. Julius Malema's testimony in the trial itself was he said it is an instruction to soldiers to go out and to kill. It then went on appeal to the Supreme Court. And they also found it doesn't amount to hate speech, and the Constitutional Court refused to hear the matter at all. There is a separate hate speech case where Mr. Malema was found liable. So that
now, Mark,
involves...
this was the case with the young Dante van Wyk, am I correct?
Yes, it is that case. So it involved basically the background to it is that there was this brawl among EFF supporters and people living in Brackenfell over this fake news story that there was a whites-only after-party for the Matrix. And then Malema gave a speech, I think that is in 22, where he says, you should find that white man and you should, put him into a corner and you must deal with him. And then he talks about why I should never be afraid of killing, especially in a revolution, and the implications the revolution is now. So he was held liable for hate speech by Judge Scher in the Cape High Court. That case, they have handed down the merits decision, and the question about what the consequences will be heard separately. So whether it'll be referred to prosecution, for example, or whether it'll have to pay damages to Mr. van Wyk, whether it'll have to pay an amount to an organization that combats racial hatred. So that hearing is sort of coming up later this year.
Now, Mark, in your role in the U.S., we would say as an officer of the court, I don't know if that term applies in South Africa, but I'll use it. As an officer of the court, you are kind of limited what you can say about certain things. We spoke previously about the other case which you were involved with, which was pretty famous. But that case, you were limited in what you could say about that because there was a chance there'd be an appeal. Is there a window for that to be over, for them to appeal? Is it done and dusted? Can we talk about that one now, or is it still something you have to be kind of mum about?
Yeah, so Kill the Boer, because the appeal process has been exhausted, I'm free to speak about it in its entirety. The other case before Mark Scher, I can speak about to some extent. There's a general rule about not trying to predict the outcomes of courts. So what I can do is say, these are the options that are available to courts. Like with regards to this, current criminal case against Mr. Malema, I could say these are the kinds of things that courts could do, but I can't tell you which one I think is likely to happen.
Well, in the Kill the Boer case, I mean, that's not what we came to talk about today, but since I can actually talk to you about it I want to ask a quick question about that. Since the appeals are exhausted, is this something that could come back before the highest court. I mean, the Constitutional Court refused to hear this time, but they could choose to hear a case if this topic comes up again, could they not?
Uh, yes. So I suppose one way of thinking about hate speech cases is that they are bespoke. So it depends on the particular facts before a court. I mean, those particular facts, are, let's say, a high watermark for the phrase. In other words, you're chanting at a rally. You've got 90,000 people in a stadium. The evidence in the trial is that, it's this from Mr. Malema is that it should be understood literally. That's an instruction to kill. That when he thinks about a farmer, he thinks about a white person. We, led lots of evidence about the scourge of farm murders, about even though there was no requirement to prove a causal link between the song and real world violence, there you do have people being murdered and killed were being written in blood above their bodies. But having said all that, yes, you could have complaints against someone for singing the song, and then a new court could consider the issue and the facts in that particular case.
When you use the term bespoke in this context, is that similar to like a precedent here in the U.S.?
Well, let me put it this way. So there's a sense in which the judgments do create precedents. So you mentioned, that Kill the Boer was found to amount to hate speech in 2011. And actually, the judgment there seems to imply that the phrase generally used would, barring exceptions. So, for example, let's say you were teaching a history lesson and you sort of gave examples of people singing the song, and then you cited it. The use in that case, wouldn't amount to hate speech. It would be describing something else. But so there are precedents that are set. And then when I say bespoke, what I mean is that the facts are unique. So there's a question as to whether you should generally ban phrases or whether you look at the phrase used in context and make a decision about it. And we tend to take that latter view. But, the law in this area can be a bit confused. So, for example, the Old South African flag, there the court was faced with a situation where there was no flag waiver. There was no incident that the court was meant to look into. That's very unusual. Basically, what happened was the Mandela Foundation approached the court to be like a legal opinion as to whether you can use this flag and whether it amounts to hate speech. And the general rule is against doing that, but the court decided to offer a legal opinion and say that, as a general rule, displays the Old South African flag amount to hate speech and unfair discrimination and harassment without a set of facts. But you could have a situation where someone uses it, and in that instance, it wouldn't be found to be hate speech. So, yeah.
Well, I would say that I really don't care what South Africa's courts have to say, but I wouldn't want to be demarched, so I think I'll avoid that phrase today.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I think it's worth discussing what Ambassador Bozell said, which is it's one way of thinking about it is a little bit like this. Have you ever read The Emperor's New Clothes? And the child sort of, looks at the naked emperor and he says, but he's not wearing any clothes. And the adults are kind of shocked, that the child would say something so obvious and true. And that's Ambassador Bozell saying, like, it's pretty obvious to the rest of us this amounts to hate speech. You can take the view that the courts are wrong, but you respect the institutions. I mean, people are critical about the decisions of courts all the time. There's a rich history of people saying, we think the court got it wrong, nothing wrong with that, but you can respect the institution, which is, as far as I can understand, his position.
Yeah, exactly. That was kind of where he's going. No, it was a trap that was a bear trap laid, and they were looking for any excuse to try to go after Ambassador Bozell, and they'll do it again. Although I think in the near future it's going to back off a little bit. Now that Rolf Meyer has been designated, the 78-year-old Rolf Meyer, key negotiator, not a very good negotiator in my mind, but a key negotiator in the CODESA and then the summit that followed after that led to the new dispensation. But I don't know if you're following that, Rolf Meyer being picked. There's a lot of people like going, what? And a lot of people going, oh, what a brilliant pick. In fact, Alec Hogue of Biz News said this was a brilliant selection. I didn't quite reach the same conclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've got a variety of parties who are skeptical. So the EFF and MK have said this is a terrible choice, as have Solidarity and AfriForum. And then I think, others who've said he's a great choice. I suppose part of it is to try and work out, was Rolf a good negotiator, in the early 90s? I think there's a sense in which, at the time, there was a feeling that South Africa was on the brink of civil war and being able to reach, a kind of negotiated settlement felt like a relief. I think in retrospect, a lot of people feel like there were certain things that should have been in our constitution that aren't, that a lot of the protections against government overreach that should have been in the constitution weren't. And so I think it's fair to be critical of, some of those outcomes. I think some of the other concerns are that Ralph Mayer formed the UDM and then joined the ANC afterwards. And so, there's a sense in which he may be picked as a, token representative of Afrikaners, but the major Afrikaner bodies are skeptical of him. And, he may very well have strong allegiances to the president and to the party. But of course, I would think if you compare him to someone like Ibrahim Rasool, who is like openly hostile about President Trump, and openly vicious on other things like Israel and Jews, that, there's some hope with Ralph, but we shall wait and see.
Well, that's all very true, but all the air went out of that balloon a little over a month before the elections took place. There was a lot of tension to build up the elections, but when the AWB foolishly pulled their stunt in Bophuthatswana, which the world saw, I mean, I saw that, watched that unfold, and when those guys were executed after acting like fools, the air and that threat from the white right just sort of evaporated right then and there, and a lot of tension was relieved. And history turned out the way it did. But yeah, there was definitely a concern that we could have a war or a race war or a civil war or insurrection taking place. But the AWB proved to be a paper tiger, and that it was the event that exposed them. That was about 6 weeks before the election. I think it was like 9 or 10 March of 1994, if I remember correctly. And then, of course, the election was 27 April. But then, of course, we still have the situation going on, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, with the necklacing and the People's War that the ANC was leading and eviscerating the Inkatha Freedom Party. So yeah, it was tumultuous times, Mark, back then. Thankfully, we're not dealing with that. A lot of people were predicting that there'd be chaos. The EFF would do riots if Malema was sentenced to anything. I said that's unlikely. This is a dying party with just a handful of sycophants, and it's probably around 5 or 6% of popular support now, if not lower. And so far, that prediction has proven to be correct.
Yes, I think that is true. And I imagine also partly the amount of support in East London is minimal. And it was interesting, watching the sentence being handed down yesterday. They had dual cameras up so you could see the crowd sitting outside. And there was a sense of shocked silence. You didn't have people, tearing things apart and being, upset. They sort of, sat there quite calmly. Malema had said something earlier, which I thought at the time was a sort of arrogant statement, which he said, "I've told the journalists that I will be going home, as will they today." And I thought that's a strange thing to say because we haven't got a sentence yet, and if you do get a sentence, there's a question about bail. But what became apparent after the leave to appeal was argued was that there was an agreement between the prosecution team and the defense team on bail, which is that it would not be contested. So it may have been the case that he'd sort of mollified the crowd outside by saying, I'm not going to jail regardless, because they knew they had this agreement in hand. And so that may have kept tensions down. But Mr. Malema did go and say inflammatory things afterwards by calling the magistrates a racist and stupid, and also making the strange claim that it's improper to have read her judgment in the merits claim for 3 days. That is very common for judgments to be read out loud until they are done. And I know judges who have read judgments for many days because it's a long judgment and you want it on the record. And the idea is that, the person who's been convicted deserves to know why. And so does the public. So that's why we have that tradition of reading them out loud instead of just saying, here's my written judgment.
Well, it is interesting because obviously if he'd said the things he said inside the court, I imagine he would have been found in contempt of court. I don't know how that applies outside of court, but certainly his comments about the magistrate and about the process were really, I suspect he's on very thin ice. He wasn't on a warning when he left court.
Yes. So we have different rules on contempt, and it's worth drawing a distinction about things that are done, let's say, aimed at the integrity of the court and disobedience of a court order. merely being outside of the court, in other words, outside of the courtroom, and not saying it to the presiding officer, doesn't protect you. There's a case called S versus Mamabolo that's one of the kind of famous free speech cases and deals with this issue of contempt. And the idea is that any old insult is not going to amount to contempt. But if what you say is aimed at denigrating the system of justice and sort of implying that it is a broken system and that no one could get a fair shake, or that it's rigged, things like that, that may very well amount to contempt. And especially when you're saying that as a politician who sits on the Judicial Services Commission, it's worth taking that sort of stuff seriously. That would be, in other words, genuine contempt is a criminal offense.
Well, Mark, I'm a layperson, but what did seem contemptuous to me was being outside the court after this decision was handed down and talking about how the magistrate doesn't write her own judgments, an invisible hand is behind the process. I mean, what, the brutal bun? What is he exactly trying to say here? To me, that was rather contemptuous of the court. I don't know if you want to or can even weigh in on that, but if I were Julius Malema, I would think that I'm on thin ice, but his arrogance still runs quite strong.
Yes. I mean, if you're implying that, what you're implying is that the judiciary has been captured by some third force, and that it is not independent and that it's not exercising, its functions properly. That's as you say, a very serious accusation, and it may very well be open for that to be investigated. Mr. Malema has made over the years various inflammatory statements outside of courts. Some of your listeners will recall that he was prosecuted, I think, in around 2016 for calling for people to invade land. And outside of court, he then made these further inflammatory statements calling on people to go and do just that, and was investigated by the Human Rights Commission for it. So, yeah, just because you're saying things outside of court doesn't give you immunity.
Well, one would think that someone, in theory, that serves on the Judicial Services Commission in Parliament that selects justices would be more well-informed about what they should and shouldn't be saying in and outside of court.
Yes, the concern, and I think it's a legitimate one for people to have, is if you hold the power over people's judicial careers, and Mr. Malema, for example, has said that he was the reason why David Untolter would be blocked from getting a seat at the Constitutional Court. He's bragged about this. That you're sort of sending a signal to judges who, seek promotion or elevation, that, if you don't play ball, I'll make your life very uncomfortable. And so that's a worry, and that's one of those things that you'd have expected, some action against him. There was a case brought by Parliament asking Malema to apologize, because in an interview for Elevation, he'd said to a judge, "Why should I give you a promotion after you found against me in the defamation case between him and Trevor Manuel?" And Parliament asked him to apologize. He then interdicted that apology successfully in the Cape High Court. These things are worthy of attention.
All right, so the title of this conversation today was "What's Next?" Let me run through what I think is next, and I think that's a good opportunity for you to correct me if I've got it wrong. So if I understand things, with a custodial sentence of 12 months or more, he's ineligible to serve in Parliament. However, he has this appeal, so until the appeal is resolved for his sentencing, he is free to continue. He can stay in the Judicial Services Commission unless the Parliament decides to remove him for an ethical violation or something like that, but he stays in Parliament. If, in fact, the sentence stays, or if they increase his sentence on appeal, which is possible, that's a dicey thing, whatever the case, if it stays beyond 12 months, he will have to be removed from Parliament, and then he serves his sentence, which, if he gets Shabir Sheikhitis, could be anywhere from 3 months to nothing. But from the moment he goes in with that sentence, he completes, let's say he does so 5 years. Then he's barred another 5 years from serving in Parliament. So potentially, from today out to at least 11 years or so, by the time he exhausts his appeals, if not longer, he would be out of Parliament in that period, if I'm correct. Now, beyond that, he could win his appeal, and then he stays in Parliament and nothing happens to him. What have I missed here?
Yes, I think that's not bad. So just to fill in a few details, the one would be on the merits, the petition process. So it remains to be seen whether a court will entertain an appeal on the convictions themselves. And then, of course, there'll be the appeal process on the sentence as well. It's possible that those could be heard together. You're right to say that the removal from Parliament requires a final sentence of more than 12 months. Of course, if you did get the 5 years, there'd be parole, and so you become eligible for parole. I think after having served a fraction of the sentence. So it might be that he's sentenced to 5 years, wouldn't serve 5 years, but the the statute regarding not being able to be in Parliament would still be in effect. So then the question is how long the process would take, and I suppose that's an uncertain question. But trials tend to be very long. So you've got this trial started in the event happens in 2018. And the trial itself was meant to start the week after I'd finished arguing Kill the Boer. And what happened there was a delay, was that the prosecutor resigned from the prosecuting authority because she said, I don't want to go through what Oppenheimer went through, because we were subject to all sorts of abuse during our hearings. So I must say that it's valiant on behalf of the NPA and of the prosecutor, Mr. Caesar, to have prosecuted this matter to the end. And I saw that there were attacks on his integrity as well. That there was a statement made from an EFF account saying that he must be taught a lesson, and this was condemned by the NPA, seeing there's an attack on their authority and on that authority of their staff. But the appeal process could be reasonably quick, by lawyers' standards of what counts as quick, not by everyone else's standards. So to give you an idea, I was involved in a case for John Quilani, which is the case that sort of sets our rules on free speech and hate speech. That incident had occurred in 2008. I think the trial was resolved by 2017, and then judgment was handed down by the Constitutional Court in about 2022. There were some COVID delays in that and some other cases that had played a role. But, I think from 2017 to the Supreme Court to the Constitutional Court being argued, that was about a year gap between each one.
Yeah, the wheels of justice do turn slowly, no doubt about that. We're still waiting for the trial to start for Jacob Zuma's arms case from 2.5 decades ago. So, that's pretty slow. He's an octogenarian now. But, I think for a lot of people who pay attention to Julius Malema, they're hoping that he gets some time in a prison cell. Certainly, he likes the apparel. He wears it in Parliament every day when he's there wearing prison jumpsuits. So maybe it's an appropriate spot for him. But I mean, we look at all the times he's escaped justice, at least from the outsider's perspective. He physically assaulted a senior police officer at Winnie Mandela's funeral, got away with that. He incited domestic terrorism, telling his followers to attack Clicks locations, and 43 Clicks locations were attacked over the Tresemme ad that came out of Europe, and one was petrol bombed. That's domestic terrorism. I would have prosecuted him for that, and nothing ever came of that. He exhorted his followers to attack people in the streets of Senegal after Brendan Horner was murdered. They trashed and did all kinds of damage to public property there, ripping down signs in Afrikaans and smashing concrete rubbish bins. Who smashed a concrete rubbish bin? But they did that. And the list goes on and on and on about Julius Malema. I think a lot of people are tired of his clownish behavior, particularly as, Ronaldo Jose was removed by his party for a 13-year-old comment, which frankly was an academic exercise on his part, not a very smart thing to do, but he was removed. But we have members of the EFF calling for the murder of President Trump, a sitting president, including Julius Malema, and of course Carl Niehaus this week doing the same thing. Yet Parliament has not taken the time to find either their actions to be inappropriate for a member of Parliament. I think that Parliament should play a role here and take action against this. Is there something that Parliament could do to Mr. Malema in the meantime because of this, or would they be wrong in pursuing it, and should they wait for an appeal to be heard?
Well, a couple of things. The one is, during the argument on leave to appeal on sentence, Advocate Hoda said that Mr. Malema has been an exemplary citizen since 2018. And that could only have a very narrow reading, which is that he has not been convicted of any crimes in that period. But you mention a litany of other things, and he has been held liable by an equality court for hate speech and all the other things. So I think if you're going to open up the can of worms about what his conduct has been, and whether this was a one-time event, just a father looking after his family stuff, or whether you're dealing with a politician who's been as you say, calling for heads of state to be murdered, I think that's worth taking into account. Yes, Parliament has generally been rather meek when it comes to disciplining its members, as kind of mentioned, the sort of call for an apology from Mr. Malema, which gets interdicted. So I wouldn't hold my breath on that front.
Yeah, no, I've just turned bluer than my background if I hold my breath and pass out. That's what's going to happen there. Well, let's shift our attention. We come back to this shortly, but I want to before you leave today, Mark. I'm sure that you're paying attention to this, but the revelations and the testimony. Of course, you can't believe half the witnesses; they're lying to cover their backside. But the revelations and the testimony taking place in the Mshlanga Commission, and then this parallel. I think it's ludicrous investigation, so-called investigation being conducted by Parliament. It's just a joke with O'Sullivan, all those actors coming in there. But the Mshlanga Commission, it really appears to be exposing a rot that most people suspected or knew was there, but wasn't really aired in public. And then we're finding out these ties about how poor Mr. Swart, the young man who was shot like 36 times when they tried to assassinate a whistleblower. Only Armand Swart wasn't the whistleblower. He was just out, doing repairs. This over the overpricing of bolts or something like that for the rail system by a figure of like 1,300% overpaying for a corrupt contract. We're discovering all sorts of things. And before this is over, I suspect we'll probably find out who's responsible for the assassination of Babi Dudeo Karan, the way this is going. But are you paying attention to this? I can't imagine someone in the legal profession you're not paying attention to the Mshlanga Commission. And any thoughts on the process? I know maybe there's constraints on what you can and can't say about it, but I found it fascinating, and it's just it appears to be reinforcing and confirming the allegations I've been making about senior members in the police across the country.
Well, South Africans are quite good at transparency and very bad at accountability. So I imagine people who breathlessly watched the Zondo Commission for many years, and Zondo himself, who produced a 6,000-page report, would have thought we've uncovered all of the terrible things that these, politicians have been doing to us and ripping off the state. And, I'm sure there'll be some accountability. And, I'm unaware of anybody being put into an orange jumpsuit over, state capture and the sort of, I think it's like, what, R1 trillion that was stolen from the country. So, yeah, I have similar concerns on this front, which is that, we'll find out what happened. We'll see if there's any accountability for it. I worry that we were all told, Shamila Batoy has flown all the way back from America to, head up the NPA, and she wouldn't have done that unless she was serious about holding people accountable. Well, the term has come and gone of 7 years, and, not much has occurred. So, yeah, I have similar skepticism about commissions.
Well, Mark, I have to be honest. Last time I was in South Africa, I was looking at a South African vernacular dictionary, and the word accountability doesn't appear there in relation to government. It's just not in the dictionary. I don't know. You may have missed that.
Yeah, we have an edited version. It's part of it's a hangover from apartheid when we would sort of cross lines out of books and things that we didn't like. We thought, accountability should be one of those things that should be removed from our vernacular.
Well, Mark, I've got to say I'm waiting with bated breath for verdicts or trials, and just a handful of things. Let's see. There's Travelgate, Oilgate. Then you've got Nkandla. You've got the PPE scandals. Let's see. Zandile Gumede's 168 criminal counts still not resolved. Ace Magashule and the asbestos tender. The Vreda Dairy Farm scandal. Doctors William Kesey's digital vibes, in which the Hawks said he was guilty of prima facie evidence that he's guilty of crimes, yet the only cost to him was being removed as the health minister in Parliament. He still sits and draws $1 million+ rand salary each year, even though there is sufficient evidence to prosecute him. And of course, then we've got $580,000 that was smuggled into South Africa, avoiding customs, failure to report it to authorities. So that's money laundering, and then the allegations that came out of torture and kidnapping, and now Wally Rhoda being thrown under the bus, and quite frankly, he deserves to be thrown under the bus, but he's hardly the only person that probably should be thrown under the bus. But that's just a few cases I'm just paying attention to, waiting for resolution. Oh, yes, and Jacob Zuma's arms scandal. I'm a very patient person, Mark. I figure when I become a nonagenarian, maybe we'll get results in these cases.
Maybe what you should do is say that until we have justice in all of those cases, you'll refuse to shave your beard. Then you can beat out Gandalf.
But Mark, I want to shave my beard, so I don't want to say that. It'll never go. Oh my goodness. Mark. So what happens next is what we probably have to wait months before this leave to appeal actually finds Mr. Malema back in court arguing his case, or if they take it up.
Yes, I would think something like that. There's different kinds of, I suppose, breaks, or whether one should be patient about how long things takes in court, or whether you think there's something improper going on. I think due process is important. This is a trial that went on for a long time. You've got to compile the documents, got to produce arguments. The court's got to read it. So there's some reason for it to take a period of time. I think there were numerous delays in the trial that there's no good reason for it to have taken 8 years to have reached fruition. But yes, one hopes that things proceed at the correct rate. You don't want the sort of like swift mob justice of putting people against the wall 2 minutes afterwards, but you also don't want the Stalingrad approach of Jacob Zuma.
Well, Mark, as a person outside the legal system who also doesn't play a lawyer on television, that would be me. I ask this question. It seems, and maybe this is just selective memory, but that's why I ask you, but it sure seems that attention was on Penny Sparrow pretty quickly, and Vicky Momberg, who was nearly carjacked and was in shock when the police responded. I'm shocked the police actually responded. That's my first point. But the police responded, and she was in shock, and then she was verbally abusive towards a black officer, and a judgment was held against her. She had to pay a pretty significant fine and was convicted and sent to prison. My recollection, Mark, is that didn't take 8 years to put Vicky Momberg in jail, or maybe I'm just not remembering the story correctly.
Yeah, I think that's very much worthy of bringing up. That it seems like justice is swift in some instances and not in others. I know with Momberg, one of the difficulties was that as a person, she seemed to be quite an unstable character, and so I think had gone through something like 6 pro bono lawyers. And she'd sort of fired them. So there is a sense in which, she was the author of her fate. I also think she shouldn't have been sent to prison. I think that's a completely terrible precedent. And our prior precedents, which date back to the 80s, are that it's actionable, to use that sort of derogatory language against someone, but also that cops are meant to have a thicker skin. And so what you'd had before were fines as opposed to jail time. And so, yeah, I think those sorts of things do leave a bitter taste in people's mouths when you say, well, this person, was sent to prison very quickly, whereas, others, have been escaping the long hand of the law for a while.
No, I think that's a fair statement. Not only has she been unstable, but she was a rather unsavory person, and that certainly didn't help her. She didn't come off very well. But I agree. But no one should be put in prison for their speech. We in the real world, when someone acts like a fool, we just disassociate from them. We treat them like a pariah. They're not invited to family picnics. We don't want them in our church. We just stay away from them. If they don't learn a lesson there, then you just stay away. But putting someone in jail for what they say. When we see people who are accused of heinous crimes like child abuse and molestation and rape and murder never come to justice or take forever to come to justice, that case really was, I think, a twisted precedent in the rapidity and speed with which it was pursued. And it also reminds me of the inconsistency of South Africa's Human Rights Commission, which is very selective in the cases they take, still pursuing Ronaldo Gos on a case that I believe has no merit, and they're going after him. Yet we've heard nothing about what's her name there, Nobs Mkhize, who on the Fly Safair flight from Durban to Cape Town deeply insulted colored flight attendants with racial slurs, and then got up and actually assaulted people and endangered safety on a flight. I don't even know if she's been banned from flying in South Africa domestically, and we don't know the outcome of that. Of course, we've got what's his name, our buddy there, who runs around and says white people are like dogs. I mean, you can understand, Mark, how some people just shake their head about some of the decisions. And I realize that's a different sort of thing. The equality court is not the same as these criminal courts. But nonetheless, there seems to be inconsistency, at least from the outside, for a lot of people.
Yes, I mean, one of the fundamental, principles of a good legal system is that there is genuine equality before the law, and that you don't have different rules for different races. I'd acted for the Rule of Law project in the Kill the Boer appeal before the Supreme Court of Appeal, where we argued exactly that. It's interesting that this was brought up in the sentencing judgment yesterday by the magistrate, saying that equality before the law is absolutely important, but that high-profile figures deserve heightened scrutiny, which is also a principle in our law. So, Mr. Malema will get the fair trial rights that everyone else should get, but he won't get any sort of special treatment on the grounds that he's a politician. In fact, because of the status that he occupies, should be taken more seriously.
Yeah, that was my question. And just one thing about the actual sentencing that took place here and the verdict against Malema. It appears, at least to me from the outside, sorry, my alert thing is turned on. I didn't realize that was on. That's disturbing people. But from the outside, it appears that in this conviction that he got, and now the sentencing, there was discussion about how he took South Africans for fools. Well, I recall that he claimed that it was a toy gun, and that was disproven. And he did that under oath when he was testifying. To me, I don't know if that's considered perjury, lying before the court. And then, of course, I didn't see it brought up, but there was this whole thing about how he and one of the security people purportedly tried to remove the receiver from the weapon and deceive the ballistics report. Did that even come to play? I didn't hear anything about that, but I wasn't able to watch some of the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for, if you deceived the court. In other words, you came up with a bogus defense, which is this is a toy gun. You can hardly be viewed as being contrite in the circumstances, and that must weigh in the sentencing. So yeah, it was correct for that to be drawn attention to.
All right. Well, that's so. Before we let you go, last thing here, there are a number of laws that have been promulgated and signed, and others that are in the process of being done, all of which were lines in the sand to at least one former opposition party in South Africa. Things like the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, expropriation without compensation, which in my view clearly undermines the Section 25 of the Constitution. I believe it's unconstitutional. I'm waiting for a challenge to that. And then you've got other things out there, NHI, which is coming down the pike, the Employment Equity Act Amendment. There are some organizations, AfriForum, Solidarity, and even a couple political parties that are involved in cases. These will probably also be very long in being played out, I would imagine, and we probably won't get any resolution on that, probably even during the sitting of this parliament would be my expectation. Any thoughts on are we going to see any movement on that? Will that come up? Will the public be hearing about these things? Because right now, the municipal elections are coming up, and for the voter of South Africa, Mark, if you're a voter in South Africa and those things disturb you, if you speak Tswana and your kids speak Tswana and you're being sent to primary school and they're being taught in English the day they arrive, which is a colonial language, haha, the irony of that. Soweto is 76 and 85. Now you're being taught in a colonial language, which is English, which is my mother tongue. So these cases, the voters are going to go to the polls and none of these will be resolved if there even is a case. And so that could weigh very heavily for or against the ANC, for or against DA or other parties. Are there any of these cases you think could get any attention before then? I don't imagine that's going to be the case. We're probably waiting to hear about this for a few more years at least.
Well, I can tell you about one of those cases, which is the challenge to the Expropriation Act. So there are 3 cases that are being brought to challenge it. The one is brought by the DA, the one by AfriForum, and the one by Die Vaderland. I'm acting for the Free Market Foundation, and we've joined the AfriForum case. The DA case makes a series of procedural challenges to the Expropriation Act. If they're successful, the Act would either be struck down for failing to comply or would be referred back to Parliament. The AfriForum case attacks the constitutionality of it. Obviously, our Constitution does not allow for expropriation without compensation because the ANC failed in trying to amend it. And so the Free Market Foundation will be supporting that case and providing additional arguments for why it is not constitutional. So that'll be we are set down for hearing in the first week of August this year in the Cape High Court. So there will be some movement on that, and that would be before the municipal elections. But finality on it would take longer, because I imagine there's a possibility, at least, that that case could eventually be adjudicated by the Constitutional Court.
Well, my point with this, of course, Mark, is that the press may or may not cover these events, particularly if this happens in August. That would be an apropos time to either hurt or to help political parties in their election. It could affect or color the outcome of the municipal elections this fall, which look to be a bit of a shocker for the ANC and for the DA. I suspect both of them are going to put a brave face on, but the PA and the Freedom Front Plus certainly are going to rise in different places, and possibly even the IFP, especially in KZN. But I think that that case coming up in August, if it isn't postponed, would certainly potentially have an impact on what voters do in the fall. Well, in spring for you guys, not fall.
Yes, I do think that voters care about these sorts of issues. No one wants to have their land confiscated from them, and seeing which parties are willing to, protect their rights and which ones are willing to violate it is pretty important.
Yeah, and it's not just the national level, which it can be done at the national, the provincial, or the local level, and that's the frightening thing for me. You could have somebody sitting in a local municipal council that decides that the municipality needs this property, and they can move on it. That's pretty frightening stuff.
As has already happened, in Ekurhuleni, where they confiscated a piece of land worth 36 million rand, and that judicial process has taken 6 years, and apparently only now is the municipality sort of recognizing that it acted unlawfully and is trying to review its own decision. That kind of chaos that you could have across the country, especially given that we have a multi-party democracy where you've got tons of little parties that run, spots all over the show, who could, decide that it's in the public interest to take, whatever land they want and pay nothing for it, would be incredibly destabilizing for the economy.
Well, indeed, and that's the argument I've been making all along. And never mind the fact that this is a basic human right to be able to own something, and it's also part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which South Africa is a signatory, as well as a violation of South Africa's constitution, taking property without just compensation. It is devastating economically. How can you sell your property or farmland? I know people that have had property of flats and houses they've been trying to sell for 4 or 5 years in Joburg, and they can't sell them because of the uncertainty. I talked to someone who the property behind them was illegally occupied by foreign nationals, and the police did nothing about it. And basically people see that as an expropriation, which has been endorsed by the state or ignored. And so the people have not been able to sell their house for 3 years, and they're just going to take a loss on it. This can have devastating economic impacts that go well beyond the immorality of what we're talking about.
Yes, and I must say props to Joe Emilio for his award-winning documentary Stolen Ground, where he talks about the difficulty in evictions. We've basically created a situation where it's become almost impossible to evict people from land that they have no rights over, and that destabilizes the economy and is very bad for property rights generally. Part of the difficulty is that our courts have said before you evict someone, you must find them alternative accommodation, and that's up to the municipality. Municipalities haven't made land available. The waiting list is like 10 years long. So in that time, the poor private property owner, bears the burden of having people, ruin their property, not pay any rent, not pay any municipal services, and lead the place to rack and ruin. So that is very much practically expropriation without compensation.
Indeed, and the threat of that is real. And not only does it destroy their property, but they become homeless. These people occupy their home. We've seen this all over Joburg. These recent raids in properties in Joburg were like 60, 80 people living in someone's property, as they divided up the house and put little Wendy houses all over the place. It's pretty shocking and sad. But with this, it's like a Damocles sword hanging over people's heads. It's very difficult and undermines economic activity. I mean, how could you possibly, I considered perhaps buying a place in South Africa, but I looked at this and I'm like, what rights would I have, especially as a foreign national, if someone does this to me? I'd be out of the country most of the time. I would lease the place out, but then what if someone just doesn't watch my property and someone comes and the Poppy Act? And what's interesting for me, Mark, very quickly, since you brought that up, is that situation, the gentleman who lost the 60 million plus rand and he invested in the Tygerberg Raceway and all the people lost that economic activity, he didn't even own the land. The city owned the land, and the city had a lease with him, and they didn't honor the lease. I think there's probably a basis for him to sue the city, but good luck with that. That's a whole other story.
Yeah. It's and I hope that Joe is able to raise funds for the sequels to that film project. And I think he's doing an incredible job about standing up for private property rights and raising issues that many other people haven't spoken about.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely brilliant. When Joe was talking about doing that, he was a little concerned about it and the threats of it, the danger of doing it. And I encouraged him to do it. I talked to him before I went there, and when we talked about his project, when I came to South Africa, and I said, you got to do this story. You've got the ability to talk to these people. You're here on the ground. I wish I could do this story. It's a fantastic story that needs to be told, and it was well deserved, the film recognition. And of course, it's a shame that South African film festivals don't want to bother to put this in a festival. But anyway, so Mark, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. And any final thoughts you want to share with anyone about the future? I don't know, the Springboks, Orlando Pirates. I mean, or maybe the judicial system in South Africa's future, or I don't know, maybe just a prediction on the weather.
I'll say this, which is that the price of freedom is constant vigilance, and there are two very comfortable lies that South Africans like to tell themselves so that they can go to sleep at night. The one is that we have a free and independent press, and the other one is that we have a free and independent judiciary. And those things are not guaranteed. I think what we found from the magistrate Malema's case really is an independent judicial officer, and that's to be celebrated. But there is a concern that once you have institutions that hold the powerful to account, that those institutions will be attacked and eroded. And so if you care about those institutions, it's very important to protect them and to stick up for them, and to ensure that they're populated with free and independent people.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for your responses today and for joining me. We went a little bit longer than we talked about before this. I hope I didn't intrude in your day. I know I've got to get back to work, so thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure. And I don't know if I see you're doing stuff on the Truth Report occasionally. I don't know if you want to do a collab on that. Let me know. Maybe we can talk about something here in the U.S. that might be interesting for the Truth Report. But thank you for your time, and I wish you, it is Friday, a very wonderful weekend.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right, folks, that's Mark Oppenheimer, who's been on the program many, many times. I appreciate him showing up on the program today to answer these questions. Of course, you understand that as an officer of the court, there are certain things he can't weigh in on, but he can weigh in others, and we appreciate his input here. All right, folks, I'll be back later today. I'm going to I'm not sure about my news broadcast because I'll be wrapping up my consulting at the War College. And once I'm finished with that, then I will be heading back to my house, grabbing my things, and hitting the road to Pittsburgh, where I'll be meeting up with refugees this evening. And then tomorrow off to Ohio, where I'll meet my sister briefly. I haven't seen my little sister in a bit. And from there to Columbus to meet refugees on Saturday afternoon, up to Cleveland on Sunday to meet more refugees, and then Monday to meet refugees in Erie, Pennsylvania. So I'll be on the road. I don't know if I'll get a news broadcast, but certainly I'll do a Night Owls later tonight. And once again, thanks to my guest, Mark Oppenheimer. It's always a distinct pleasure. And to everyone out there, thank you for being here, and I will catch you hopefully later today. You all take care, and be sure to hit that like button if you don't mind. By the way, it costs nothing. People complain about how expensive life is, and petrol prices and the war in Iran. Well, the war in Iran doesn't affect the like button. All you got to do is push it. And in theory, it drives the algorithm so we can actually get some views and get some more subscribers. In practice, I don't think it works, but it still looks nice. Y'all take care. Have a good day.